Cool. So last thing from last time. Today I want to talk about a handful of kind of like interrelated topics. I want to discuss what is nationalism and what is genocide, like as terms, right? And then we'll give you an example of genocide from this period we're talking about. I mean the Ottoman genocides during World War I, and then we'll talk a little bit about a political philosophy that emerges in the immediate aftermath of World War I, out of the radical nationalisms of the late 19th and early 20th century. It proceeds into a movement that we can refer to as fascism or neo-fascism. The terms, of course, always sort of like loaded for people. Most fascist movements in world history have not actually called themselves that because it does specifically relate to the Italian movement, but it's used in a kind of like looser sense in scholarship in the same way that the term fundamentalism technically only refers to a 19th century Protestant movement in the United States. But obviously we talk about Muslim fundamentalism and Hindu fundamentalism and everything else, right? So it's taken on a broader sort of categorical meaning, and I'll walk you guys through the basic characteristics and how we can recognize it. And it will be sort of relevant in that although the Zionist mainstream in the early 20th century is going to be a kind of interesting mix of left-wing economics with a bit of nationalism, there's a much stronger nationalist component that is actually explicitly fascistic and actually founded as a copy of fascist movements in Eastern Europe before migration into Palestine. And that will actually be the ideological roots of the current hard right parties in Israel. Like Netanyahu's party founders are literally connected to a 1930s fascist movement, which is not well understood or acknowledged. So we'll need to actually understand what this is if we're going to talk about it going forward. Who goes apart? All right, so here's your typical bad jokes. All three of these assholes, you know. All right, so first one I want to start with is nationalism, right? What is nationalism as a term? I really, really want you guys to scrub out of your freaking heads that patriotism and nationalism are similar in any way. People often describe nationalism as like an extreme form of patriotism. Like, I super love my country, so I'm a nationalist. That's nonsense, right? And you guys, again, being college students at a good university here, have an opportunity to engage in those water cooler conversations for the rest of your life and slap people around when they mix these terms up, right? It'll be really, really helpful if you can do that, because I'm so tired of seeing this. Remember, nations, states, and countries are different things. A nation is a group of people with something in common. What defines it is the movement itself that's going to build a nationalism. Because while there are elements of national identities that have been there since antiquity, one of the reasons I start this class the way I do in the ancient world to show some of those cultural features, until you develop a political ideology related to it, it doesn't really matter. It's just a distinct culture. But nation, race, and ethnicity are all just flexible social constructs that you can create as in and out groups that you can put people into and take people out of, which means you can use language in defining a nation. You can use religion. You can use common origin. You can use a common history. You can use any mix of various features. This is how we end up with like weird shit like white nationalism. Is white, right? You have to define what that means, right? People can come up with all kinds of forms of it. Christian nationalism, white nationalism. It can be based around the possibility of a particular country, maybe, but nationalism is never about serving your country, and nationalist movements are frequently opposed to their country. This will be true of Jewish nationalism in Israel. There are Jewish nationalists in Israel today who routinely take shots at IDF soldiers who come too close to their settlements. They don't actually like their government. So never mix it up thinking that nationalists are patriots. Patriots love and serve their country. And remember that just a simple distinction between state and country is a state is just the governing institutions, and countries are states that have sovereign control. So Palestine is definitely a state as well as a nation, but is not a country. Cool so far? You see the distinction, how that kind of all works there? Nationalists want a country, a state, for their nation, for their particular in-group, and not for others. Nationalists are never for, oh yeah, let's have a country with equal rights for all people in it. It always has exclusions to it. Think about the foundation of this country, right? If you're looking at American nationalism, who did it exclude early on? Who was excluded from American national identity? Black people were excluded, right? Clearly don't count. They're not citizens. We have multiple Supreme Court cases saying, yes, you are definitely not a citizen. Who else wasn't a citizen? The indigenous people, yeah. The Native American populations, the tribes in the United States that long predated and who were acknowledged to have national identities. They were called nations. They weren't citizens until 1922 because America's national identity, the nationalism here, the sense of peoplehood excluded them. And since the state was created for that peoplehood, it cut them out. Make sense? So even countries that have a civic nationalism like the US, it doesn't have as strong a historical link to an ethne or like some kind of cultural history. It still will have the same kind of exclusionary phenomenon. It will still have an in-group and an out-group, right? Always important to keep in mind here. This is one of the reasons that people criticize nationalism. It's because of its exclusionary capabilities. Whether you're okay with loving a country or not, that's a whole separate question, right? It's completely distinct. Patriotism and nationalism have completely different objects, right? The state or country versus the nation, right? Definitely stop mixing up country and nation. It's so frustrating. Okay, so there's that. Nationalism as an ideology really has its origins in the late 18th century. It's debated where it first shows up because it's kind of building up slowly in the air, especially in the aftermath of the Protestant Revolution and the Reformation and the wars of religion, where with countries wanting to find some kind of a common ideology they can use to link people together other than religion. Because, I mean, religious identity got, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of all German-speaking peoples in Europe killed, right? You're a Lutheran, you must die. So they're like looking for an alternative, but it takes quite a while for nationalism as a political ideology to take shape. The French Revolution is the best early example, in my opinion, especially since you can see it, captured by a particular national movement in the north there, and then using things like the levée en masse, like a mass conscription effort to then teach people how you are French and you fight for liberty and equality and all this shit. Here's our flag. And you have to start by teaching them a language. France is one of only, 2 or 3 countries in all of Europe still not to recognize any minority languages. So if you speak, Provençal or Gascon or Breton or Picard or something, or even German in the East, if you speak any of those languages, you are systematically being oppressed. There's a form of cultural genocide that's been being carried on in France for almost 2 centuries now, slowly replacing those original cultures with the culture from the area around Paris. Make sense so far? I think it's a really good early example of nationalism as an ideal. And nationalism will spread all across the 19th century, and governments will think that they can use it or manipulate it as an idea to link people together, to fight together better, sacrifice together better, improve the local economy. But nationalisms also frequently get out of control. And themselves, popular nationalist movements can capture control of the state. They can act against the state. They can lead to massive atrocities. Governments trying to manipulate nationalist sentiment are often unleashing a beast that they can't truly control. And so, I don't know. I mean, you're kind of like using the sentiments or whatever and making like, you're fulminating against something. And next thing you know, there's like riots and people are like burning down embassies and shit. So it has a popular emotional component to it that's difficult actually to contain. But there is a reason that elites in Europe began cultivating these movements and inventing nationalisms. The national identities of Europe are all artificial. And this is more true as well everywhere else in the world, because the basic concept of it doesn't even come from there. At least somebody in Europe invented this idea. But everywhere you look, there's a massive amount of diversity. I mean, Germany still today has like Sorbian speakers, people speaking like an actual old Slavic language that was indigenous to the area around Berlin, right? It's dying out, but it's still there. Tons of languages, tons of basic diversity in all these areas. Until the 19th century, nobody spoke Italian because Italian didn't exist. Think of that because right before us, there's a class in the Italian language, right? But Italian is a made-up language based on the Tuscan language. They just took the Tuscan base, they tweaked a little bit of its grammar and vocabulary, added a few things from some of the other languages there, and said, boom, here's our standard language. We're going to teach this in all of our schools. But Tuscan and modern standard Italian are not mutually intelligible with like Neapolitan or Sicilian or Venetian. They're completely different Romance languages. Make sense so far? So you had to invent Italians. You had to conjure them up through a political process. And as that idea spreads across Europe in the 19th century and then outward into the world through the colonialism and imperialism project, it's going to have significant effects in world history and lead to untold amounts of violence, right? So at the end of the day, a lot of our modern struggle between Israel and Palestine is well conceived in nationalistic terms as two competing national identities, both romantically attached to the same chunk of land and the idea of wanting their own ethnic state on that land. And because of the nationalist component, they're constitutionally incapable of recognizing the other's claims, right? There can't be Palestinians because that would acknowledge that they have a right to live there, right? So you have to deny that there is a peoplehood there, right? You have to, both sides will go back and forth here denying the legitimacy of the other's personal identity, and that gets really problematic. Make sense so far? Okay, so slightly simpler topic in some ways, but a complicated one for us to deal with going forward, right? Genocide has an official definition because the term it's a neologism. It was invented in the 20th century. It's weird for people like me that study classical languages growing up. So, because it combines a piece of Greek and a piece of Latin in the same word. So it's like, nails on the chalkboard, it doesn't make sense, but whatever. We're stuck with the word. But there's a UN conference after World War II that gives it an actual legal definition that everyone signs on to, right, in being a member state. And it involves these 5 features. But crucially, you don't need to have all of them. Any one of these qualifies you to call something a genocide. I mean, the Nazi Holocaust, probably the most famous genocide in world history, only fits 4 of them. And the only one I know of that hits all 5 is the Ottoman genocides against the Armenians. It's really rare to have a lot, right? But think about what some of these might be. Okay, so killing people. Everyone sort of assumes like the killings is what makes genocide, right? But that's only one possible aspect. You could also be causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. So direct oppression of people is a form of genocide. Arguably, things like South African apartheid and Jim Crow in the US were forms of genocide specifically because they were meant to oppress people and make them feel like shit where they live, right? Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. So blockades, collective punishment, starving populations, refusing to invest in different communities. There's all kinds of things that can go into this. Anything intended to harm a group's ability to thrive specifically because of their identity fits this. That gets really challenging. I mean, you can take it in a very simple example, right? So in the modern state of Israel, the government invests in communities, right? It'll lay down infrastructure much like any other country does. And let's build water, treatment plants and sewer systems and everything else, right? But the investment in Jewish communities is many times that of investment in Arab communities. And I'm talking about Arab Israeli citizens of the state. 22% of Israel's population, its citizen population, are Palestinian. And their communities are routinely starved for resources. Arguably, that can fit here because it's calculated to harm that community based on their identity. Make sense so far? You see why this is difficult to bring up? Because we tend only to think about the first one. but there's a lot more aspects to this as a term in legal terms. Imposing measures intended to prevent births, right? And then the last one here, forcibly stealing kids. So think about like the residential schools in Canada or the US or Australia where they like took indigenous kids and put them into somebody else's care. That's genocide because it's intended to destroy an identity, destroy a language, destroy religions. Cool. This is obviously the only one the Nazis didn't do because they were super racist, right? So they just shot kids, right? The Ottomans actually stole a bunch of them. So cool. Now, as far as like, I don't know, how you can address it, like what would be the actual crimes? Because if you want to think about genocide in international legal terms, what is a crime that can actually be proposed? Well, first off, like actually killing people, right? Or conspiracy to do it, like wanting to try and do it. Or how about incitement to it? We should kill all of the such and suches, right? Would be a punishable crime under this international legal definition here. Attempts to do it that are somehow stopped, right? So, and then complicity in it. Did you allow this to happen? Did you facilitate it? Think about, like, I don't know, French collaborators in the Holocaust, turning people over, right? Yeah, sure, they were under occupation, didn't have their own government, you know, blah, blah, blah. But if French citizens stepped up and said, he's a Jew, get him, that fits. Make sense here? You see how this is also more complex because it involves a ton more people. And you don't actually have to have pulled it off for it to count as a crime. Right? I really wish people paid more attention to this because this shit goes back to the 1940s as a definition, and people still have no idea what it is. And just wrote, oh yeah, only like what the Nazis did is genocide. I mean, you run into it all the time. Like if you start talking about different, neo-Nazi or neo-fascist movements, like, well, you can't say our movement is like, neo-Nazi or whatever, because we don't have concentration camps. We're not killing people. Like, dude, Hitler didn't have death camps in 1934. He sure as hell didn't have them in 1924 before he was in power. Was Hitler not a Nazi in 1924? Do you see how nonsensical that is? So the fact that you haven't done it yet has literally nothing to do with whether or not you have that kind of ideology. The beliefs do still matter, and our beliefs do have direct consequences in the world. And movements like this can capture power. Cool so far? So, knowing what this is, I think you can tell I get kind of passionate about this sort of subject. Sorry, I apologize. I've been studying extremist movements for most of my adult life. You know, one of the things that first got me sucked into history was seeing stories of atrocities, like, I don't know, shit in Central America, like they're like, blowing up health clinics and throwing nuns out of helicopters and shit like that. What's going on here? Like I got interested in what would motivate people to do genuinely horrific shit. And it really took me down a lot of rabbit holes. So I spent a lot of time studying religious fundamentalist movements, political extremist movements. I spend way too much time interacting with horrifying human beings. So, okay, so there's that. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys my very short take on the Ottoman genocides. We're not going to spend a huge amount of time because, again, the class is focused mostly on the Israel-Palestine conflict, but understanding something about these movements will help. And it'll help, too, when we actually talk about the Nazi Holocaust and its impact on this movement to see how is it similar and different from what happened here in the Ottoman Empire. Because the fact that they got away with this shit matters. What Hitler did probably couldn't have happened if they hadn't gotten away with it here. Because it's a little different when people are getting away with it out in the colonies, right? Everyone in Europe was racist as fuck. When the Germans were like slaughtering people in Southwest Africa, nobody cared, sadly, right? They finally apologized 100 years later, so with them, I guess. But the fact that it happened right there in Europe, right? And to a Christian population, you would have thought that other Christian countries in Europe might care. No one did. That kind of matters. So we think about where Armenians really are. They're all over the place. There are much smaller numbers farther west. in Anatolia, but they do exist in all the major cities over here. But more of their villages are going to be found from the Kilikia region here, stretching all the way up into the historic Armenian heartland in this area here, in the area sort of like bounded by three old lakes, right? That they've been in that population since the early Iron Age, right? And some elements of their culture actually go back to earlier Bronze Age, cultures like the Urartu people that were on the same location before. I think there's some really deep roots in the area here. The question of whether or not this is a genocide is political only to assholes, because it is physically impossible to deny that the Ottoman genocides were genocide. Doesn't stop the Turkish government from doing it, because its problem is the actions that take place here in the late Ottoman Empire against a number of minority populations are driven by a powerful ethno-nationalist movement. And ethno-nationalism is literally the founding ideology of the Turkish Republic. So while it's a different government, and you could say, we're not directly responsible for that past government, just like, I don't know, the current government of Russia is not the Soviet Union. They're clearly different governing institutions and constitutions. But if your founding principles are the same, it forces you into a weird quandary. And the Turkish government routinely has to deny this, because otherwise it forces them to question their own commitment to nationalism. This is one of the problems you often end up with tons of countries around the world, and you see like nationalists freaking out about things. Ultimately, if you talk about crimes earlier in a country's history, people will think you're somehow delegitimizing the whole country or saying it shouldn't exist, right? That's not necessarily the case at all, right? Us talking about the genocide of Amerindian populations doesn't mean that we should like burn down the whole country and all like, kill ourselves. I mean, come on, what you can do is actually address the ideological structures that caused it so you don't do it again. This is a real problem when you get to things like the Israel-Palestine conflict, because we'll get to talk about some serious crimes in the creation of the state that most Israelis would rather pretend never happened at all, because any mention of them makes you think that you're delegitimizing the country itself. Right, that's a whole different question, right? Being able to learn from the past is difficult. And what makes it most difficult is if you're committed to an ideological framework that was directly responsible for the atrocities. That's the problem you have with Turkey. You see the issue here? And again, not all Turks, there's tons of great Turkish scholars that talk about this stuff, use a lot of records that go into it. But the government itself and a significant part of the population are hardcore committed to denying this. Their biggest claims here hinge on the question of like intent. Did we intend to kill all these people? Right? Was that the whole point? Well, I don't know. When you're playing football with the heads of people that you've cut off, it's kind of difficult to say that you're not really looking down on these people in a way. Their argument tends to focus on, well, what we were really intending is what we call today ethnic cleansing. You're removing the population. There's a war in the east there, close to the Caucasus frontier, tons of Armenians. There were Armenians on both sides of the border. What if our Armenians side with the ones on the other side and start shooting us in the back? So it's like we have to remove this fifth column threat. That's their argument. Already that's bullshit, because there was effectively no Armenian nationalist movement. And the Armenians on either side of the frontier actually spoke different forms of the language even. They didn't have a whole lot in common. But that's their argument. This falls apart in one really key way, and one of the reasons I started with the definition of genocide. This already counts. Even just using this term is problematic. You guys know our language has certain power, right? The term ethnic cleansing is ultimately unnecessary because it's literally a form of genocide. It fits the definition already. By calling it ethnic cleansing, you're kind of letting people off the hook. It's similar to an interesting question in American history. You guys, what did we do to the to Japanese Americans during World War II? What happened to them?
Put them in internment camps, right?
Yeah. Now, what's problematic about the term internment camp? This is one of those fun ones there that we always pass around words that we've heard without actually ever looking them up. It's similar to like nation, right? People say nation all the time when they actually mean country. because they never bothered to look at any dictionary where a nation always says a group of people. Internment is for prisoners of war, enemy combatants. By calling them internment camps, we are still perpetuating the same racist logic that underlied their creation. We are saying Japanese Americans were disloyal to this country. Do you see why that's a problem? They're concentration camps. A concentration camp is just a place you build to put people together. That's also a complicated one, and we'll talk about when we get to the Holocaust, because concentration camps and death camps are different things, right? Most of the Nazi camps were not death camps, but some of them were. But we tend only to think about the mass killing ones, right? A concentration camp is just putting people in this big old outdoor prison and concentrating them in a particular location. It actually starts in the Imperial Project, and the British used them in the Boer War in the 19th century. Calling them internment camps uses the same racist pretext that they used to pass that, those orders in the first place. Kosovar, words matter. So their argument here has to be denied just on that basis alone. But it's clearly not just an ethnic cleansing, because they killed a ton of people. And we have a lot of records from people on the ground talking about this, watching it, seeing it happening, confronting the government, saying, hi, I've got all this eyewitness testimony of you, like, starving people, shooting them, doing really fucked up stuff like, pregnant woman is struggling to keep up. So the soldiers like place bets on the sex of the unborn child, take out their swords and cut her open, leave her there to die, right? Somebody old is struggling to kind of keep up with the forced marches. So you just walk up and shoot them, let them drop on the ground, and then just keep on going. What do you think happened to young girls every night? Right? Taken out off to the side by the soldiers where they all take turns, and then they have to get up the next day and still walk. Right? I early on had to go through a bunch of video recordings of old Armenian women recounting the stories of what happened to them when they were 13 and 14 years old. And these are women in their 70s, and they're still crying, trying to describe it, right? It's just horrifying shit. If you're doing that, you're not just moving a population. You see what I'm getting at? So, difficult to deal with. Armenians are spread all over the place. That's the yellow there is them. So you can see there's not much of a reason for a nationalist movement to exist anyway, because there's no homogenous area that's mostly Armenian, right? They're always spread around amongst tons of other peoples. What they were hoping for was the same kind of rights everybody else had. Basic progress of it, and you do in just a couple of minutes here. You start by taking out the intellectuals, newspaper editors, priests, anybody with a significant standing in the community that can motivate people to fight back, spread the word, things like that. Take them, arrest them, put them on their knees, put a bullet in the back of their head, off you go. Next, draft all the men. So you're rounding up men and, hey, it's wartime, you're drafted now, but I'm not going to give you a gun, I'm going to give you a shovel, start digging a hole through that mountain so we can take a train through it, get to work. And then when particular work gangs finish particular jobs, they dig a mass grave and they shoot them all. And then they just draft some more Armenians and get back to work. Why take out the men first? When they go to the villages to round up the women, the children, the older people, there will be fewer people willing to dig guns out from under the bed and fight back, right? So it gets easier to handle these massive forced marches out, of people essentially defenseless. We often see pictures of Nazis using cattle cars and packing tons of Jews into them. The Turks did it first. And crazily enough, they frequently charged them for passage. Buy a ticket, jam you into a cattle car, and then take you off to die. Right? Really, really fucked up stuff. And as with the Nazi Holocaust, one of the saddest things about the Armenian genocide is that it worked. In the places where their population was highest, there are literally no Armenians. They are gone. The Western Armenian language is extinct in Turkey. You can hear it in places like Glendale here, from older people mostly, but it's a different language from the one spoken in the modern country of Armenia, right? It's a very different form of the language, right? The Western Armenian language is essentially extinct. That culture has been driven out. So again, it worked. The total number dead for Armenians is probably somewhere around 1 million. Some Armenian sources attempt to say every now and then there's up to 1.5 million. I think that's too much of an exaggeration. Some sources try to say that it's a little less than 1 million. I think that's also bullshit. I think the best sources we've had so far in terms of the scholarship on it puts it somewhere around 1 million dead. Right? Still a damn lot of people. We'll never know exactly because records were not as good then as they are now. But there's a lot of evidence of this, right? It's completely unavoidable. And if you just use only Ottoman sources, you still see it. Just like the Nazi Holocaust can be proven by looking at the thousands of tons of paper documents left behind that they didn't manage to burn. Wouldn't even need physical evidence. We can literally read them saying what they did, right? You have a ton of this stuff here from the Ottoman world as well. And just to let you guys know, since the Armenian genocide is talked about more in the US because we have a small Armenian community here, there were also Assyrians, Syriacs, Chaldeans, and Greeks killed. Right? All of these are minority populations that lived in the parts of the Ottoman Empire that they were determined to hold on to at the end of the war, no matter, come hell or high water, right? To create like a homogenous Turkish homeland. So anybody who didn't fit that is a problem. So tons of people are killed off here. Up to 800,000 Greeks were killed, right? Which is a huge number of people already, almost equivalent to the number of Armenians killed. It's a smaller percentage of the total population than the Armenian population, because there were a lot more Greek speakers, and most of them got expelled after the war. But they still killed a lot of people. And then a few 100,000 Assyrians and Chaldeans were killed. Right? So it's a lot of dead people. And afterwards here, no one really talks about this shit. There's no real consequences for it. Right? You don't have big war crimes trials. They kind of get away with it. So the lack of historical memory. I mean, the Nazis could say, who today remembers the Armenians? And boom, no one did, so they could get away with it. Cool, cool. Time we have left here too. Okay, so ready for a breakneck run through a little bit of a definition of fascism? The way to do this, I think, is not to focus on any particular movement, but to think about basic core characteristics, emotional considerations. Again, most radical nationalist movements do not use this term, and not all of them perfectly fit it either. So you get a similar situation like where with genocide, you don't need all of them. So there are quite a few that are very close. Like I tend to characterize Franco's Spain as para-fascist, for example. It has almost all of them. It's very much akin, but it's not quite like not perfectly lined up with, say, Italy or Germany, right? So but you can still roughly categorize them as a fascist state, or like Salazar's Portugal or Metaxas's Greece. There's tons of movements in Europe, right, that fit the basic definition, right, to varying degrees. So I'm going to give you 9 basic features, right, 9 basic characteristics of it that if you see all or most of these in a movement, you are looking at a fascist or neo-fascist movement. And I'll define the difference between fascist and neo-fascist at the very end. It's actually quite simple. Okay, so first, fascism is anti-liberal, which means it's opposed to things like human rights discourses, majority rule democracy, a free press, right? It wants to kind of clamp down on some of those kind of things, right? So there's illiberal components to it, but it's also anti-conservative. And that trips a lot of people out, especially in the US, where we frequently use the word conservative badly. Conservatives are people who say, this is fine, don't change much from here. And as we change, because every society is going to evolve, change slowly and with respect for tradition. Conservatives don't say, this is terrible, this is degenerate, this is backwards, we need to go back to where we were. That's a reactionary movement. Fascism is reactionary, right? When you have people saying, this is wrong, we took a wrong turn, we have to go back, you're not a conservative anymore. Make sense so far? So fascism is a kind of radical politics. It is calling for a regeneration of the nation, a kind of reconstitution of the nation. It says this is somehow degenerate or broken, we have to fix it. And that requires some kind of radical change. Conservatism is never calling for radical change. Fascist movements always do. Cool? So anti-liberal and anti-conservative. It's also hyper-nationalistic. And again, don't mix it up with patriotism. This is a patriotic symbol, ultimately. Well, this fella is more of a nationalist than a patriot, but still, the symbolism is complex, right? And people frequently use these things wrong. By nationalism here, again, we mean support for a particular understanding of peoplehood. And if you're excluding certain populations from that definition, you're talking about nationalism. So Fascist movements are always hyper-nationalistic. They want a government and all power for their understanding of the people and not for anybody else. Cool? Now, how are you going to drive a lot of this forward? How do the ideas spread? This is where conspiracy theories are so important, right? Rumors, innuendos, there has to be some kind of threat, frequently both an internal and an external enemy. External enemies could be like completely different cultures, populations, something else. We hate them over there, but there's always somebody at home that's a problem. You know, it could be the communists, the Jews, the undocumented, Muslims, you know, people speak this other funky language we don't like, you know, like any kind of group there that stands out as somehow subversive. Oh my gosh, the college professors, ooh, right? Oh yeah, the college professors are brainwashing you, right? So they're an enemy of the people. You have to have an enemy, and that enemy can't actually be a threat. If it was a real threat, this doesn't work, because the purpose of this is to say, I can save you. I will save you from the Jewish menace that's going to destroy our country. The Jews of Germany were not going to control that country. They didn't run the country. They weren't a threat to anybody. They just wanted to like buy bread, go home, do what anybody else does, right? Make sense? But, you know, you use fear of a particular outgroup. So again, see how it's related to nationalism? There are people that seem distinct or different, and you can label them as an enemy of the nation, and then the great leader can say, I will fix it. I will save you from that. Cool? So conspiracy theories are super important, and they can never be lost. The biggest problem with this, I see this all the time. Liberals in particular in the US waste countless hours arguing with people over their weird conspiracies, thinking that like logic and reason are going to work here. They don't have to be logical. They don't have to make it because they're not intended to make sense. That's not how they function. So trying to give somebody a reasoned, evidence-based argument for why their idea is batshit crazy is never going to work. There are ways to approach those issues, but that's not the one. Right? It's taking it, you're talking past each other at that point because you're using a completely different mental framing of the problem. Cool? So there's an irrational component to fascism. This is one of the reasons it's so difficult to define in political philosophy, and there's so much amazing like debate in the scholarly literature on this. I have an entire bookshelf on, you know, theories of fascism, discussions of it. I mean, there's a lot of lively debate among us on like what all it really means, because it isn't a systematic philosophy. You can't precisely define it because it is based on emotional appeals, which is why I define it generally with characteristics, not philosophy, right? So the crowd is important. Let's all get, yeah, like we're all like part of a movement. We feel connected to something. We feel part of this groundswell. It's supposed to touch you here, not here, which is again why the conspiracies don't have to make any damn sense. All they have to do is scare you. Fear is a powerful motivator, and fear is ultimately irrational. Cool so far? So being part of a crowd, being part of parades, rallies, and having symbols, we're all going to wear the same color shirt. We're all going to like have the same slogan or chant. We're all going to use the same meme or like phrases or whatever. Like there's a kind of like uniformity to it that connects you to an in-group, right? And it plays upon that sense of self. And there's frequently in a lot of that a real sense of grievance or victimhood. We are being victimized by this other people. It's like, you know, we are the victims of the great Jewish conspiracy that's going to destroy us all. So we have to like rise up against them, or they'll do this, that, or the other thing. Right? You have to have some kind of like, again, an enemy here. And it's charismatic in the sense that it has to have some kind of leader cult. This is one of the Achilles heels of all fascist movements, is that they struggle with a succession method. What happens when the leader symbol you've rallied around is gone? I mean, Franco died, Spain went back to being a democracy. Salazar is gone, Portugal went back to being a democracy, right? It's very difficult to transfer that credibility from one person to the other, right? Because so much is built around the fact that this guy knows it, right? Trust only me. Don't listen to the college professors. Don't listen to the scientists. Don't listen to the media. Don't read books. Listen to me. I know the truth. I can solve all of your problems, right? When you build up that kind of emotional support for a particular movement or ideal, it's very difficult to back down from it. Here's a sobering statistic, right? Something I really would love you guys to think about, reflect on the weekend, right? Hitler came to power with the support of about 1/3 of the German people, right? Opinion polls in Germany 10 years after World War II in 1955 showed 1/3 of Germans still approved of Hitler and wish he was still in charge. This is after a war that killed 50, 60 million people in Europe and revelations of the Holocaust. They knew the consequences of it. The same people are like, yeah, Hitler's my man. Nothing changed. Does that make sense? It's really hard to let go of those ideas once you have them. It's very difficult emotionally to admit that you were conned, that you got it wrong. Few people can ever do that, right? So it's problematic for the movements because it's difficult to have another leader that follows and has the same kind of appeal to people, but it's also very difficult to get people out of this sort of ideal. So the charismatic aspect is important to it. This is probably the most complicated and weird aspect of any definition of fascism. And one of the ones that is most dispensable in a number of movements around it. Corporatism is not about what we call corporations in the US, like the business charters or whatever. A lot of people on the internet are using corporatism in a completely batshit way to say like, oh yeah, it's like, kind of like, capitalism or whatever. Now, corporatism is creating something in between working people and businesses to represent their interest. A corporate body in that sense is like some kind of state institution to replace things like labor unions. So ultimately, all fascist movements, despite basing their appeal in the working class, we're reaching out to working people. You're telling them class consciousness doesn't work, worker solidarity doesn't work, workers shouldn't be thinking of themselves as workers, they should be sacrificing for the nation. So you want better pay? Trust us to create this corporate body that will try to get better pay for you. In practice, it never happens. Mussolini's corporate bodies actually greatly decreased living standards and working standards in Italy, right? But it's very important for fascist movements to criticize anything other than national consciousness. So while it makes populist appeals, and populism in this sense is an appeal to ordinary people, an appeal to workers, right? Fascists and socialists are actually pitching their things to the same basic people in class terms, like working people. It's not generally aimed at the super rich in either case, right? In practice, a lot of the base of support from most fascist movements is actually what we would call in the U.S. middle class, or petit bourgeois, like small business owners, like in lower middle class. It's frequently not the very poorest working class people, but they use the same basic language. They make the same kind of emotional appeals to the downtrodden workers, the left behind, do you want the banks and the bosses to be crushing you, right? So it frequently uses anti-capitalist language, even though it aligns itself with the business owners. Fascists have never opposed private property or private ownership of the means of production. They've never actually had any socialist component. No fascist movement has. But they use similar appeals to working people by pointing to the crimes, right, of big business owners and whatnot. Cool. So populist, not socialist. Last one, very simple one here. Fascist movements are always misogynistic. And you can see this from the very beginning with Mussolini in 1920, appealing to working men in Italy. Do you want to compete with women in the workforce? Support me and I will send all those women back home to the kitchen to get pregnant or whatever, right? And you can have the jobs again, right? It always go from Mussolini in 1920 to YouTuber Sargon of Akkad in 2020, with his anti-feminist rants. Anti-feminism fits this, right? Make sense so far? So it always has that kind of hyper masculine, appeal to people. Last one, very simple. What is the difference between fascism and neo-fascism? Classical fascism tends to think much more in terms of a powerful state and military. So it's much more in favor of completely dispensing with democracy and having a military dictatorship. After World War II, most fascist movements have preferred to maintain some of the trappings of democracy, but control it. So Russia today is a fascist state. Putin's party is literally a fascist party. He regularly quotes fascist writers from the 1920s in Russia. right? But they have rigged elections, so they can pretend still to be a republic. Make sense? So aiming for a managed democracy, and then one of the places where it gets complex with the whole corporatism aspect here is frequently, instead of a super powerful state controlling everything, it's a collaboration between the fascist movement and major businesses, major corporations, to essentially turn over a ton of control to that oligarchy. That's what we mean by inverted totalitarianism. So it's basically a mix of private tyranny connected to the fascist movement, as opposed to a single hyper powerful state controlling and investing in everything directly. So it's a little bit different from, say, like, you know, Hitler or Mussolini doing a lot with the state. But there's elements of that from the beginning. Hitler actually privatized a ton of the Weimar Germany's infrastructure. So there's always a connection with the business class. But it's a much stronger link to the business class today than it was before. Cool. So those are the two main differences between neo-fascism and fascism. The biggest one is just using democracy as a shield to cover up. Right? It's not really democracy anymore, but it's a lot harder to say, I want a military dictatorship and actually get support. So I guess I'm out of time to rant at you. I did manage to get through it, which is kind of remarkable. You guys survived? Okay. All right, cool. I completely like burn your brains out or something. This is right here on this shield from Charlottesville. This is the fasces. That's an ancient Roman symbol that was adopted by the Italian fascists. It's a symbol of authority. A lot of these groups are quite public about it. The thing to keep in mind is that most people who align with these movements don't do this. They just tacitly support the same ideas without the funky costumes. Cool so far? But some people do take the mask off. Okay, so have a lovely weekend.
Thank you.